Is Israel really preparing to strike Iran's nuclear facilities? Tensions between Israel and Iran have reached new heights, fueled by reports suggesting that Israel may be preparing for a potential strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure. While military posturing and intelligence leaks often form part of a larger geopolitical chess game, the question now resonates louder than ever. Is Israel genuinely planning a military strike, or is this part of a strategic maneuver to influence ongoing diplomatic efforts between the United States and Iran? Mounting friction between Washington and Jerusalem. The rift between the United States and Israel over Middle East policy has become increasingly pronounced. From differing views on how to deal with Hamas and the Houthis, to deep disagreements over the Iran nuclear file, Washington and Jerusalem are clearly not in lockstep. One major point of contention is the U.S. approach to diplomacy. The Biden administration has engaged in indirect negotiations with Iran aimed at reviving or modifying the 2015 nuclear deal, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. At the same time, the U.S. has been negotiating with Hamas to secure the release of American hostages in Gaza and with the Houthis in Yemen to de-escalate attacks in the Red Sea. Israel views these moves skeptically, if not outright critically, believing they reward hostile actors and undermine broader regional security. Israel's view, the Iran deal is a threat, not a solution. From Israel's perspective, any deal that allows Iran to retain even limited nuclear capabilities poses an existential threat. Israeli leaders have repeatedly criticized what they view as the West's naivete in dealing with Tehran. They argue that Iran uses negotiations as a smokescreen to buy time while advancing its nuclear program underground. According to recent U.S. intelligence reports, some of which were shared with CNN, Israeli officials are considering military action against Iranian nuclear sites. These revelations raise important questions. Are Israeli leaders genuinely contemplating a strike? Or is this leaked intelligence a form of strategic messaging intended to pressure Iran or even the U.S. to harden their positions? Strategic signaling or genuine threat? There is speculation that these intelligence leaks are not accidental. Some analysts believe they may serve a dual purpose, warning Iran that time is running out for diplomacy, while pressuring the U.S. to reconsider the benefits of re-engaging with Tehran. If Iran believes that an Israeli strike is imminent, it may choose to return to the negotiating table more willing to compromise. Similarly, if the U.S. sees the situation as spiraling toward conflict, it may abandon the idea of a deal altogether. This tactic, sometimes referred to as calibrated escalation, uses the threat of military force as a tool of diplomacy. However, it can be a dangerous game. If either side misinterprets the intentions of the other, it could trigger a conflict neither party truly desires. Is coordination with the U.S. likely or necessary? Military experts overwhelmingly agree that Israel is unlikely to carry out a large-scale attack on Iran's nuclear infrastructure without prior coordination, or at least quiet consent, from the United States. The stakes are simply too high. An uncoordinated strike could trigger Iranian retaliation not just against Israel, but against U.S. forces and interests throughout the region, including military bases in Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and Iraq. Tehran could also mobilize its network of regional proxies, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon or militias in Syria and Iraq, to expand the conflict into a wider regional war. Despite Israel's advanced military capabilities, proven in past operations, including precision strikes in Syria and Yemen, striking Iran's nuclear facilities would be far more complex. Many of Iran's critical sites are heavily fortified and located underground, which would likely require specialized munitions and support that only the U.S. can provide. What if Israel strikes without help? Should Israel choose to act unilaterally? There are serious doubts about whether it could inflict lasting damage on Iran's nuclear program without U.S. assistance. While Israel has a strong air force and a long history of successful covert and overt operations, destroying deeply buried facilities such as Fordo would be a monumental task. Without U.S.-supplied bunker-busting munitions, a solo Israeli strike might delay, but not destroy, Iran's capabilities. This limitation might explain why Israel is emphasizing the threat of a strike now. If the U.S. is not inclined to act militarily, Israel may be using the threat of unilateral action to pressure Washington into either joining an attack or applying greater diplomatic and economic pressure on Iran. The diplomatic domino effect. Whether or not Israel intends to strike, The specter of military action is already affecting the ongoing nuclear negotiations between Washington and Tehran. If Iran believes an attack is imminent, it may respond in unpredictable ways. It could walk away from talks altogether, increase its uranium enrichment activities, or prepare for a regional confrontation. Each of these moves would severely undermine U.S. efforts to achieve a diplomatic resolution. Conversely, the threat of war might force Iran to make concessions to avoid conflict. This is perhaps the outcome that both the U.S. and Israel are aiming for, to compel Iran to strike a deal under pressure, but there's no guarantee Tehran will respond this way. Former President Donald Trump, during his tenure, repeatedly stated that the U.S. would consider military options if Iran approached nuclear breakout capability. With the 2024 election looming and Trump a likely contender, Israel might be anticipating, or even trying to influence, a possible return to more aggressive American foreign policy under a future Trump administration. The risks of escalation. Our real U.S. intelligence sources speaking to CNN have warned that a preemptive Israeli strike could ignite a much larger conflict in the Middle East. The region is already a tinderbox. With war still ongoing in Gaza, political instability in Lebanon and Iraq, and the fragile security situation in the Gulf, one spark could trigger a widespread conflagration. Iran's potential response would likely be swift and multifaceted. It could target oil infrastructure, disrupt maritime traffic in the Strait of Hormuz, or launch missile attacks on American and allied bases. Cyber warfare and economic retaliation could also be part of Tehran's toolkit. Such escalation would have global consequences. Oil prices would likely skyrocket, global trade routes could be disrupted, a full-blown regional war could involve not only Israel and Iran, but also the U.S., Gulf states, and non-state actors across the Middle East. Does the U.S. want a war? Despite public rhetoric, it appears clear that the United States wants to avoid another war in the Middle East. The Biden administration, already managing the conflict in Ukraine and a delicate balance in East Asia, would prefer a diplomatic path forward. However, this depends not only on Iran's willingness to negotiate, but also on Israel's patience. There may be scenarios where the U.S. quietly supports Israeli pressure tactics while publicly advocating for peace. But Washington is well aware of the risks of being perceived as complicit in a preemptive strike. That perception alone could put American lives and assets at risk. Conclusion: a delicate dance on the edge of conflict. So, is Israel really preparing to strike Iran's nuclear facilities? The answer is possibly, but not definitively. The threats may be genuine, the plans may be real, but that does not mean a strike is imminent or inevitable. What we are witnessing could be strategic signaling meant to shape diplomatic outcomes, or a last resort being prepared should diplomacy fail. In either case, the situation remains fragile. Both Washington and Jerusalem are navigating a high-stakes game where miscalculation could lead to devastating consequences. Iran, for its part, must decide whether to test the resolve of its adversaries or seek a way back into international legitimacy. One thing is certain: the coming weeks and months will be pivotal in determining not only the fate of Iran's nuclear program, but also the broader security architecture of the Middle East.